Hello everybody, welcome back to the Self-Starters Podcast. I'm Kieran Naidu. It's been a week. It's been a very, very long week. Maybe it's just for me, and I have good reason. This week I went down to the depths of hell. I got my driver's license renewed, and my gosh guys, let me tell you, if you remember the nightmare that it was pre-COVID, let me tell you, it's exactly the same post-COVID. It was one of the first times I've wished we were back in lockdown, just because we lived in a time where you could drive around with an expired license and it was fine. It didn't matter the fact that you hadn't renewed your license in about 35 years because COVID. And well, with COVID being gone and the bloody licensing printing machine back from its holiday in Germany, we have no choice but to make the trek back to our licensing stations and get those bloody damn things renewed. So that's what I did this week. I had already made one failed attempt. I went to the Randburg licensing department and the system was offline. Surprise, surprise. So after about 10 minutes in the line, I said, I ain't wasting any more time today, Satan. And I went back home. And it took me 2 weeks to get another appointment, but I booked at Waterfall, which I was told was the cleanest, the fastest, the most technologically advanced place in the whole of Johannesburg. And when I got there, well, let me tell you, it was a glorified post office. Oh yeah. But anyway, enough about my nonsense. Today on the podcast, we have the wonderful Dan Nicol, who I honestly believe has the greatest job on earth. What is his job? Well, he is the host of the eponymous Dan Nicol Show, where he interviews some of the greatest sportsmen and, well, just general celebrities that this nation and pretty much the globe has to offer. And so on the podcast, I asked him all the questions that I wanted as a budding host and interviewer myself. And I wanted to know, how has he managed to land this dream job? These aren't going around easily. What did it take and what was his journey like? And guys, can I just say that Dan has really made a habit of turning the things he enjoys into great, profitable ventures. He also has something else called Dan Really Likes Wine, a virtual show that showcases some of the greatest wine that South Africa has to offer. I know a couple of you who would love that job. And on the podcast, Dan unlocks his secrets as to how he has managed to put himself in the right place at the right time to become the person who managed to turn his passions into his profession. So this is Dan Nicol on the Self-Starters. My name's Kieran Naidu. This is the place where we learn how to turn our ideas into action. I hope you enjoy. Dan, I must say, I think you have every sports lover's dream with the Dan Nicol Show. And, you know, having had a look into your background, I saw you studied English at UCT. I'd love to know the journey from how you went from an English graduate to I think having one of the most enviable shows in South Africa.
Yeah, I often get asked that question, but where you phrase it with excitement and admiration, I get it from my mother with exasperation. That's why I haven't found myself in a real job yet. It's certainly not been a planned journey in terms of here are the boxes I want to tick along the way, and this is how I'll get to where I'd want to be. I'd always loved playing sport. I was quite good at playing sport to the sort of first team provincial junior level, but never quite good enough to make good of my dream, which had been to play cricket for Zimbabwe, which is where I grew up. I was born in Northern Ireland, but grew up in Zimbabwe. And I think like many kids of my era, makes me sound terribly old. We didn't have the same sort of distraction that a lot of kids have today of jumping onto iPads and phones and 1,000 different television channels. And so we spent most of our time outside kicking balls and imagining that we were Brian Lara scoring another 100, or we were John Alamu barreling over for a try. And that love of sport was just part of me growing up. And I thought I'd always get into sports somewhere, and sports journalism was where I thought I would be. And I was very lucky. I got a scholarship to go to university, and I could choose which university I wanted to go to, provided they would have me. And the University of Cape Town had always been the place I'd wanted to go. My mother is from Cape Town. My uncle was the then Deputy Vice Chancellor, probably how I got into the university. And I thought, right, well, I'll go and study sports journalism, only to discover that that wasn't an option then at UCT, but English was. And so I started off doing my Bachelor of Arts at UCT and doing a degree that focused on English and history. I did 1 year of drama, which involved stuff like being a depressed rabbit for hours or pretending to be a tree, or didn't really strike a chord with me. But while I was doing all of that, I'd started doing a bit of radio work when I was still at school in Zimbabwe. And UCT Radio was a platform which had provided an opportunity for a lot of people in the entertainment industry in South Africa to kick off their creative intent and avoid trying to get a proper job. And so I started off, I went and auditioned with UCT Radio, and I got one of those prime slots where I was midnight till 2 a.m. On UCT Radio on a Tuesday, and that was my broadcast slot. But it changed pretty quickly, and by kind of the end of my year, I was doing the drive show on UCT Radio, and I made it a very focused sports show, mainly because this was an opportunity for me to try and meet sports people and basically just be a bit of a sports fan. And so that's how the show took shape, and that kind of gave the initial direction into becoming a sports writer, becoming a sports presenter, and sports becoming a really big part of my life.
That's amazing, and I'm so glad to hear your story about UCT Radio. I'm also a UCT Radio alumni.
I knew I liked you, Kieran.
And it's just so funny how you had a very focused view on UCT Radio, whereas someone like me, and I think the reason why this podcast exists is because I did it for probably 6 months. I was also, I think I had the 2 to 4 a.m. slot. So, I mean, this is even the graveyard shift doesn't even want to look at that slot. And after a while, I got an afternoon slot, and then I gave it up because it clashed with my accounting class. And you best believe I've regretted that ever since. When I reflect back, like, why would I do that? So it's amazing to hear, even at that stage, the level of intentionality, and I think also just having the ability to then attract sports people in. So you were basically able to further your career and also have some fun whilst doing it. And straight out of university, you landed a gig with Cape Talk as their morning sports anchor. Is that correct?
It was actually while I was at UCT.
Wow.
The station got a phone call, and so whoever answered the phone, and I can't remember who it was, but I'm forever grateful to them, was asked, is there anybody who can do sport? And they said, well, Dan can do sport. So off I went that afternoon for an audition. I didn't even know it was an audition. I thought I was just going to meet somebody, and they popped me in a studio. Did this, and I thought, right, well, maybe in 6 months, a year's time, I might be doing one of those 2 to 4 a.m. slots on Cape Talk. And the next morning, I was doing the breakfast show. It was literally overnight. The next morning, I was on with Martin Bailey, and I then spent about probably 6 or 7 years in that space. And I think you talk about how you had the clash with accounting. The view then, and I'd like to think it's changed. I'm not sure it has, but I'd like to think it's changed. In doing a Bachelor of Arts degree in English, there was a fairly narrow view on what you were capable of doing as a result. It was either teaching or was asking people how they wanted their steak done. Didn't have too many options. And if that sounds a little facetious, when I finished, I was in a digs full of business scientists who were all being offered lavish weekends away by accounting firms and by consulting firms. I was offered a 1-year unpaid internship with Unilever, except it wasn't guaranteed. I still had to go through a process. All one very sweet company has just completed my honours degree in English with a first-class pass, offered me the chance, paying for myself, to do a year's secretarial course in Durban to try and further my career. And that's kind of where what I did was seen, which was really sad, because if you look at universities in Europe, a lot of the students who go into the big corporate jobs have come out of humanities degree space, where the lateral thinking and the creativity is highly valued. That wasn't the case in the late 90s, early 2000s. in Cape Town. And so what I was doing, although it was great fun and I thoroughly enjoyed it, I also realized this is what I have to do if I'm going to try and make something of myself. And so falling into Cape Talk, working with some extraordinary people like Martin Bailey, like John Matham, who was incredibly grumpy and terribly dressed and still the most gifted radio presenter I've ever come across, just an extraordinary person. And from all those people, often without knowing it, without realizing it, you begin to learn so much and you pick up on what people are doing, what they're good at and why they're good at it. And often the better they are at something, the harder it is to work out why they're good at it, because it is so natural for them. But if I look back now, and that was, 20 years ago, that was a hugely formative space in understanding not just where I wanted to go, but what I probably needed to do to try and get there.
And maybe let's talk a bit more about that. So you almost land this job coincidentally, and just okay, I'll come into the radio station, and okay, flip, I'm now on your morning talk show. At which point in that journey did it cement for you that okay, this is exactly what I want to do, and I'm in this space? And how far were you dreaming at that point?
If I'm honest, at that stage, there wasn't an absolute certainty. I knew that now I was on radio. I was clearly extremely famous. I would be living in the Caribbean 6 months a year with models, and life was taking off. But it was more, I think I was just really enjoying the space that I was in. And I loved Cape Talk, and when I say this is what I want to be doing, I think it was the broader space that I wanted to be in. But it also didn't take too long between Cape Talk and then not long after that, I got the job as the sports editor at iAfrica.com, which, amongst other things, indirectly opened me up to the food and wine industry, which is another part of what I do now, and which we'll talk about a bit later. But it also exposed to me the very similar to the philosophy I have on teaching. My parents are teachers, and like so many teachers, incredibly devoted, dedicated people who shape hundreds of lives through their careers, if not thousands, and generally get paid pretty terribly. Media, you're not going to get rich, with very few exceptions, on being a journalist, but you provide such an important service. And so while I was enjoying what I was doing, I was enjoying radio, enjoying writing. I really do love writing. I wasn't making a huge amount of money. And so it was kind of teaching me, right, well, you like this space, you like the engagement, the creativity of it. How do you then work it into somewhere where you can keep enjoying it, but you can do something that's a little more financially rewarding? And at university, I'd started emceeing events, doing a lot of the RAG events, causing a lot of chaos. I apologize deeply to the UCT staff. I shut down university for an afternoon after telling everybody that it was a half-day public holiday. So well, I hid in my residence for a week afterwards. But that emceeing, that speaking, that engaging, became kind of post-radio, pre-television, what I was doing, traveling around the world, hosting events, speaking to audiences, and learning that the interest I have in people, the love I have of engaging, of trying to make people laugh or tell them a good story or have a bit of fun with them, was something I was able to translate into more than just something you do over a couple of beers with a few mates. You can actually turn this into space. And I think that time in radio and the time with iAfrica.com taught me a whole lot about the craft and about what I wanted to do, but it also helped me to reframe and become a little more goal-oriented in terms of, without wanting to sound like a heartless, soulless capitalist who's just desperately chasing the dollar. I did want to make sure that I was doing something that I enjoyed, but that I also, I wasn't getting a bit nervous in the last week of every month and ignoring calls that looked as though they might be from a bank. And so that kind of learning process gave me a lot more focus towards what I'd like to do and where I'd like to be.
And where does that entrepreneurial spirit come from, where you're taking on gigs whilst at university and thinking about how do I find a solution to wanting to have make sure I have enough of a paycheck at the end of each month? Was it more the necessity that drove the entrepreneurial spirit, or was it something else?
No, look, the necessity will always be part of it, because you do need to eat, you do need to look after yourself. But if I go right the way back, I remember my first year at high school. And again, I'm probably saying things that will retrospectively get me into enormous amounts of trouble. But my wife's a lawyer. I'll back up. I went to two particular spaces. We had the Rugby World Cup coming up, and the Zimbabwean rugby team were training, and they were in camp, and the All Blacks and the Wallabies and England ahead of the 91 World Cup would all have been in 5-star hotels. The Zimbabwean rugby squad got sent to the dormitories of a high school in rural Zimbabwe, and that's where they were training. And I happened to be going to the bathroom as one of the rugby players was going to the bathroom, and he asked if there wasn't anywhere they could get some coffee. And half an hour later, I had bribe is a very strong word. I had financially encouraged 3 or 4 of the senior students, who were kind of our monitors, to lend me their kettles and their coffee and their sugar, and got these all down, and ended up preparing the evening for the rugby squad. Sold it off to them at what I thought was a vast expense. And it was cool to get some money, but it was just the buzz of having created something out of nothing. And I did something later on that year. I created a kind of a club, and again, there were possibly 1 or 2 shady aspects to the execution of it, but I got lots of brands to send through sort of posters of cars and models of tractors, and then offloaded them at a slight financial benefit. And again, you made some money, which was cool, but it was more, this was fun. I really enjoyed this. And I think that kind of spirit, finding new spaces where you can test yourself, where you can see there's a gap, where you can help a brand or help a person, or just help to tell a story. And I think that's where the appeal has really been. And yeah, again, you make some money out of it. That's a great thing. And we all enjoy that. But it has genuinely been, it's a space I love getting stuck into, and love seeing a new opportunity. Can we make it work? Probably not. Right. Well, we'll definitely try it then and see what happens.
And I love how that's translated into your later life. So you've had Hazard Golf, Skududu Media, and Dan really likes wine. I'd love to know a bit about the genesis of all of those different endeavors.
So Hazard Golf Clothing, may it rest in peace, was a great deal of fun and taught me one very, very firm lesson: avoid going into fashion retail at all, ever. Probably the biggest reward out of that, when I first got into the sports media industry, nobody knew who I was. I was a young hopeful, and I got sent off to these golf tournaments. And so I started wearing these garish and outrageous and often fairly horrible pairs of golf trousers. But it was a great way to get noticed. It was a visual business card. Who's that guy wearing those ridiculous checks, or that terrible tartan? And so you meet people and you get to talk to people. And it was a calling card for a long time. And we tried running as a business. I worked with one of the big retail houses in Johannesburg. They'd had a lot of success with high-end fashion. But as you quickly discover, it's not about how good your product is or how nice it looks or how good looking and athletic the ambassador of the product is. It is distribution. And when you've got a product that isn't just a one-off, it comes in different sizes and different shapes and different colors, and people don't want to buy stock, they want to hold it. And then if they sell it, then they'll give you some money. And so it was a lot of fun. And it opened up a lot of doors. But in the end, we had to gently put it to sleep, rocking it in our arms as we said goodbye. But it was a really good experience, and I loved it. And it was a time of my life where that worked out quite well for who I was and as a personality. But it also, it taught me some lessons, and a lot of those have now fed into what I do now. And I think one of them was patience. And if I go back to those days of coming to end of radio, I did one season hosting Champions League for ETV. But before that, my last year of university, first year out, I made what was effectively the prototype for the Dan Nicholl Show. I'd watched a show in Australia where I'd lived as a 16-year-old, as a Rotary Youth Exchange student for a year. I'd a show called The Footy Show, Australian rules football, which did two things I hadn't thought possible from what little television I'd watched growing up in Zimbabwe. Here were people laughing about sport. There was fun. And we can't do this. Sport is serious. Make jokes and be rude about the sports people. They're gods. But the Australians are having great fun. And the channel that it was on didn't have the rights to the Australian Football League, the tight shorts and the vests, and they couldn't show that. And so they produced a show every week that was based purely on the personalities of the people they had on stage and coming up with fun ideas and different things to do. And it was both so simple and yet so clever. And I thought, I'd love to do something like that one day. And I think I can. And I got chatting at the end of the Currie Cup, this would have been 2001, with Bob Skinstad, who was the captain of the team at the time. And he had seen a show in New Zealand called the Lion Red Sports Cafe, which was also very similar. They'd take the mickey, have a lot of fun, just so different to anything in South Africa, where sport sat within a very conservative set of parameters. And we had a conversation at a bar approaching midnight, where so many good conversations do happen. And we thought, right, well, let's give it a crack. And we ended up bringing out the guy from the show in New Zealand. And we filmed a pilot. It had a ridiculous storyline about Bob having lost all his money. And we filmed him with a piece of cardboard at a traffic light in Mowbray. And it was all very silly, and but gave us an idea of it. It got nowhere at that stage. Nobody had a clue who I was, and sports people were supposed to play sport, not make television. But that was the kernel of it. And in 2015, we finally got the shows. That was 13 years later. The Dan Nicholl Show finally premiered on SuperSport. A different concept in terms of its mechanics, but very similar in terms of let's enjoy sport, or in the case of the Dan Nicholl Show, sport and beyond, because it's more a celebrity lifestyle show than just an out-and-out sports show, and do something that's just not in play at the moment, and kind of all those little lessons along the way, the patience, you'll make it work eventually. Those are what I think allowed me to hang on to that particular dream and to eventually, many years later, make it work.
And what do you think what was the transition in the industry between, I guess, that first concept in 2001 and the show actually coming into fruition in 2015 that made it possible?
I think a few things. The television landscape had changed when we were looking in 2001. And there wasn't a huge amount of television, and there wasn't that much of an impetus to be different and to change, because the space was owned by the same people pretty much, and they liked what they were doing. Fast forward to where we were, and there's suddenly new channels and there are new people getting involved. And at that stage, 2015, there wasn't a Netflix or an Amazon Prime, but there was certainly movement in these spaces. And there was also more of an openness to do things a little differently and to have a bit of fun. There was also the fact that by that stage, I'd been in the industry for 12, 13 years. I knew a lot more people. I'd moved up to Johannesburg. I'd found the right partner to help me make the show with. And then when we made the pilot, and I'll be honest here, it did have the feel of a rather low-budget high school theatre production. One of the guests on both the pilot and in the end, our very first episode, was Pete Goff-Wood, the MasterChef judge, who he was laughing the other day. I had dinner with him in Cape Town, and our guest came out from behind the curtain backstage. The curtain was actually literally against a brick wall, and they were holding in tummies to fit themselves in that gap. But we had, and this was just a serendipitous moment, we had in the studio audience for this pilot, and a little stage in Linden, a lady called Suzanne Stevens. She was one of the three founders of BrightRock, the life insurance brand. And she saw something in that show I'm not sure even I saw. And she felt this could work. And it spoke to who they were as a brand and what they wanted to do. And I think she saw the storytelling potential. And she signed on. We had a little bit of an arm wrestle with Supersport to sort out what would be an appropriate time. And they gave us a 30-minute slot, and the Dan Nichols show got underway. And at that stage, you asked me earlier about kind of plotting and thinking ahead in radio. At that stage, I was just, I've got the show on. That's all I really wanted to do. I wonder if I could maybe get a second season. And we sat down at the end of that first season, and we sat down with Bright Rock, and we said, yeah, we've had the first season. We've had some big names. We think it's gone quite well. Will you sign on for a second season? And they said, no, but we will sign on for 2 more seasons. And then we went to Supersport and we said, look, we've got our sponsors on. We've got this show. Will you give us 2 more seasons? And they said, no, unless you extend the show from 30 minutes to an hour. And that was the start of season 2. And as we speak, last week, you can see I'm starting to grow my holiday beard, just to look a bit more like you, really, Kieran. We've just finished season 15, and season 16 will kick off in September.
That's incredible. And when you reflect back, can you believe that you're at this point? I mean, 15 seasons is a remarkable achievement.
Yeah, there's this kind of show doesn't often have longevity, and the fact that it has is, it's not something that I can beat my chest about and say, oh, this is all thanks to Dan that it's lasted this long. What we've done is found not formula, because that suggests that we pay it by numbers each week, but found a space, I think, that hadn't really been occupied, and that brings together in South Africa an extraordinary array of people who are able to tell wonderful stories that don't just entertain my audience or me, they actually entertain the other people on the show. And that creates this space where, when the show's at its best, you're almost watching people who seem to be 3 good mates shooting the breeze while telling remarkable stories about themselves and looking like they've known each other forever, when quite frequently they've met an hour earlier when they've arrived in the studio. And I remember there were a lot of people, and often quite kindly, sometimes not, but often quite kindly, saying to me that they really didn't believe that this particular show would work, and just don't get your hopes up too much. And one of the criticisms was, well, Dan, you're just not the person to host this show. All right, that's a bit more incentive to make sure I do get it right. But they also said, we don't have enough celebrities to make this kind of show last. And if I look through the course of this 15th season, there were probably 5 or 6 of our 13 shows where every single guest had never been on before. Mm. And those who are back have got a brand new story. They've just done something extraordinary. They've just reached a milestone. They're about to do a new show or a new movie or play for a new team. And so they've reinvented themselves. And it's really nice to update. So being able to find these people, and not just the person who is the Springbok captain or the Bafana Bafana goal winner or the Banyana coach or the actress who's just got a Netflix job. But our last episode of the season, this past season, was a guy called Tinashe Nyamudoka. He's a sommelier who came to South Africa from Zimbabwe with nothing a decade ago, and is now one of the 4 stars of Blind Ambition, The Cool Runnings of Wine, this documentary that's won awards at the Tribeca Film Festival. So if you can tell a story, then you're onto the front foot. And we've been really fortunate that over 15 seasons, we've just had so many fantastic stories to be able to tell.
And I'm going to ignore what other people said, and I'm going to pat your back a bit here. I think you do an incredible job. And I think one of the difficulties of being a host on a show like the one you have is you aren't necessarily the star of your show. You're there to tell other people's stories. But at the same time, you have the difficulty of building a genuine rapport with your audience and getting them to a point where they're willing to watch the show, even if they don't know the guests who are sitting on the couch around you, and they're watching it because of you. And to get to 15 seasons means you have definitely done that. Talk to me about how you've curated that relationship with an audience when, again, your job is really to make your guests shine.
Yeah, you make the point exactly. It might be the Dan Nichols show, but I am not the star of that show. And my job is to pull the strings and to segue out of one guest and into the next, and find a way of doing that so it isn't too jarring as you're trying to go from a front row forwards to a ballerina and trying to at some point of intersection. And it's to make everybody feel as comfortable as you can. And I'll open up the show each week, and you try and set that scene of everybody being happy and having a good laugh. But you've actually started an hour or two before, when you've been sitting with everybody as the show works out, getting to know them, telling them a bit about it. We don't script the show. I don't give people a list of questions, partly because that takes away the immediacy of the show and people being off the cuff and telling you stories that are absolutely genuine. But also because I don't often know what we're going to do on the show. And I don't say that as we just wing it and we fly by night. But I can ask you a question about Survivor, Kieran, and then you come back to me with an answer that I was not expecting. If I've then already got question 2 planned and go back to it, I don't take advantage of the opening that you've given me from some fantastic answer. Similarly, you might have said something that gels brilliantly with one of the other guests, and either they want to chat about it or I want to bring them in. So you've got to have that ability to work really off the cuff in terms of where are we going with this show. Still know we've got 13 minutes till our ad break. Know that I've got this wonderful video of Kieran emerging in a Speedo on a beach that we must use to do wonders for our numbers.
I said that to you in confidence.
But also to know that you're trying to get the very best out of these people and your best out of the show, and you don't know what's going to come. So it's being light on your feet, and you're almost directing the show from the host's chair. And occasionally you might get one of the guests, often one of the younger sports people who hasn't been in this kind of show before. They're just used to a cliche-ridden press conference space. Yeah. And you maybe just need to give them a little tug in the right direction, bring them out, make them feel comfortable. And that's really what you do. And when the show is at its best, I sit back and I watch it and I enjoy it. And I really hope that's what people at home are doing as well.
Absolutely. One of the interviews that stood out to me or stories was Chris Morris talking about when he was sold at the IPL auction. And just, I'd never really listened to Chris Morris talk before then. I'm like, jeepers, what, so much personality and such a fun, interactive story for, exactly to your point, I think a younger sports personality without as much media training probably would have given a very curt response, as opposed to taking us on this whole journey. Who have been some of your favorite guests on the Dan Nichols show?
So this is where your podcast becomes an 11-hour production. You get asked that question a lot in a variety of ways. And yes, sometimes it's because it's a really huge name and you're really excited. Sometimes it's because of the conversations. But to give you a few, we had a show which we did last year. We do a number of shows from different locations, and I do a show every year from the Alfred Dunhill Links Championships in Scotland, the big golf tournament, which for the last 11 years I've hosted the gala dinner and the events around for. And it's a wonderfully daft event, just Hollywood A-listers and pop stars and titans of industry. Johan Rupert has created a magical event, and it's the highlight of my year every year. And we've done a number of shows from there. We did a number with Shane Warne, and I remember Warney very, very fondly. He had that ability to just light up a room. And he was very candid, and he told a couple of terrific stories. One, the story about Brian McMillan and how Brian McMillan had stormed into the Australian dressing room wielding an AK-47. It was actually a service revolver, which he still probably shouldn't have done. But Warney told some great stories, and he was always fantastic. We also did a show last year from the Dunhill, where we had Tom Chaplin from Keane, the band. We had Ruud Gullit, the footballer, and Tico Torres, the drummer from Bon Jovi. And that was a wonderful example of three people just sitting down, kindly letting me sit in on their session and talking about the ups and downs of who they were and where they'd been. And Tom Chaplin moving effortlessly from his time as a student teacher in Pietermaritzburg, of all places, to the time he'd spent in Cocaine Anonymous and how he'd had to deal with that. And Tico talking about playing to 2 million people spread over 5 blocks around Times Square. Ruud Gullit talking about his relationship with Nelson Mandela. And also the pressures of being a footballer and never wanting to go off injured in case somebody else took your place and you didn't get it back. And just having at times searingly honest conversation of the sort that a lot of these kinds of interviews don't normally stray into. So that one will always stick with me. A guy called Chris Burtish. Chris is absolutely barking mad. He's currently on a stand-up paddleboard somewhere between California and Hawaii. And this is his second trip like this. He did the first one. He was the first person ever, mainly because nobody else would be stupid enough to try and do this, to stand up paddleboard from basically across the Atlantic Ocean. Took him 3 months on his own, no support vessel, a modified board, so he had a bit of a cabin in it. But he would tell stories about how in the middle of the night he felt his craft going underwater because a giant squid had attached itself to his parachute anchor, and he had to put on his wetsuit at 1 a.m. in inky blackness and dive into the water to cut it free to save his boat, or waking up again in the middle of the night to his radar beeping because within 2 miles there were 3 cargo ships or oil tankers converging on pretty much where he was, and nobody answering any of his calls and just waiting to see what happened. And he, like Ron Rutland, the adventure cyclist, like Grant Lottering, who's the only person we've ever had on the show who's died before. He was declared dead after a cycling crash and came back remarkably. But these are people who I think when you listen to them, where we watch an A.B. de Villiers or a Brian Habana or a Tatiana Schoonmaker, and we see them in a light of kind of celebrity otherness, with a lot of these other guys, there's a blue collar sense of identification. You know, that especially someone like Ron Rutland. I mean, he looks like a third team rugby prop forward, cycling around the world, raising money for charity. And you think, you know what? He's like me. I can have a braai with that guy and have a beer with him, and I sense a shared identity or kinship. And yet he's done something extraordinary. And it's some of those guests who I think have really had an impact on me and had an impact on a lot of people watching, from the mail and the correspondence we get. People saying, you know what, that guy's pretty amazing, and it makes me feel maybe I can do something similar. So those have been some of the really good ones.
I'm sure it's quite an honor when people start sharing quite personally on the show. It's not something I'm sure you expect of them, but to have that openness is great. We can almost just throw the cue cards away and just let them tell their story.
Yeah, and you do a fair bit of preparation, and one of my personal favorites is when somebody shakes their head. Dan, how did you know that? And often it's because you've sent a message to a friend or a teammate or somebody they know, and they said, "Oh, Dan, you must ask that." But also, we've created a space where we're not carte blanche. Derek Watts is a great friend of mine, and I'll say this on the record, an absolute clown. Forget the perception he might show on television. Loves having a laugh. But we're not trying to expose anybody. We're not trying to show you falling out of a nightclub at 3 a.m. or coming out of a hotel and that's really not your husband. Or that's not what we're about. We'll embarrass you, but we'll embarrass you by showing you in that Christmas jersey your grandmother knitted for you when you were 3, or stuff that's more personal. Because of that, we've created a safe space where people who might otherwise be a little hesitant to come onto the show, it's okay. It's Dan. It's Dan's show. We can do that. We had John Dobson, the winning coach from DHL Stormers, the other day. He was telling us about to start a story, and he stopped and he said, you know, it's the Dan Nichols show. I can say whatever I want. And you have a bit of a laugh at that, but that's also a really nice endorsement.
Absolutely. And I almost view you as a host, you collect stories. Whose story out there would you still like to collect?
Sure. Again, it's a tricky one because you could say, we're a show based in South Africa, although we go out across Africa, and whenever I have a guest from another country in Africa, I get inundated with stuff. Why aren't you having more Rwandans on the show? Which is lovely to see, and it speaks to the footprint of DSTV.
Absolutely.
I'll tell you a story leading into that. I do a lot of work as an MC and a lot of events, and going back a good 15 years, maybe longer, I was doing a very big event for one of the mobile phone networks. And they had said to me very clearly, we've got 6 members of our board of directors. You need to introduce them, name check them, and get their titles. And their titles weren't, President Sales. It was Senior Executive West African Wireless Units and Logistics Connect. Absolutely ridiculous stuff that required an A4 business card. And when I MC, when I speak, I'll have maybe a running order, but I don't write a script. I work off the cuff. I'm just more natural that way, and that's how I like to work. So I'd committed all 6 names and titles to memory, and I ran through and I got all 6 of them. I even pronounced the colons. That's how good I was. And I could see the head of the marketing unit just sort of nodding with relief. And then I had to introduce the comedian. I'd never heard of the comedian before. And this often happens. They get somebody along and they do the evening, and often you have to do a bit of repair work afterwards. But before we go into dinner, very special act tonight. One of my absolute favorite up-and-coming young comedians, and I forgot his name. What happened to me? Now, I did have it scribbled down, so I just ducked my head and back up again, but it was perceptible. Anyway, so I introduce him, off I go. This kid comes on stage, says, "Oh, no surprises. First thing the white guy does is forget the colored guy's name." And I thought as I walked to the back of the room, feeling embarrassed and cross with myself, or at least he's some young no-name comedian, and I'm never going to have to worry about this before. The comedian's name was Trevor Noah.
I had a feeling.
And he's done all right since then. So to tell Trevor's story kind of on the South African terms and his journey in America would be a lot of fun. And, so that would be a cool one to do. And a couple of the other South Africans, people like, say Dave Matthews, who's had such a remarkable journey. But then also some of your own, the people you've watched or really enjoyed, or people you've grown up with, the movies of somebody like Denzel Washington, who, always been great. But then also people, and I get to meet a lot of them through the world of Laureus. I'm an ambassador for the Laureus Sport for Good Foundation. And we had a friend of mine from Laureus on the show earlier this season, Andrei Shevchenko, the footballer, played for Milan, played for Chelsea. He's Ukrainian. And it was a very moving and emotional interview where we spoke about what's happening in the Ukraine and what he's trying to do to help his people. And it was lump in the throat stuff. And so being able to not just tell stories of people who you might not know so well, but to be able to tell the stories of people that they really want to tell. And that's often where we have on the show our most success is you can ask the cricketer about cricket, but bring up surfing and you've absolutely got him. You talk to Dale Steyn about surfing or fishing. You talk to Keshav Maharaj about cooking. Hashim Amla is a great surfer. So many of these people have different interests, and they're often seen through one particular in one particular light because we know them as footballer, as tennis player, as actor, as singer, where it turns out there is that other element of real passion, and you give that to them, and they're almost as difficult to stop as it is me on this particular podcast.
No, I'm loving hearing your story. One more question about the Dan Nichols Show, and then let's quickly talk about Dan Really Loves Wine. Going into your 16th season, when you think about the future, what do you envision as the evolution of the Dan Nichols Show?
It's a difficult one to answer, not so much because of the show, but more because of the landscape in which the show works. I did a short digital series during lockdown where at one stage I was doing 7 or 8 different shows a week in a desperate attempt to avoid having to homeschool my children. I would do Welcome to Mechanical Engineering with Dan Nicholl. I would do anything. I did a really, really interesting series where I took 8 top business leaders. I had a meal delivered to them from my friend Bertus Basson, the South African Chef of the Year. I had the same meal delivered to me, and over a meal, sitting in our respective homes, offices, over a call like this one, we spoke about who they are and what they'd got to. And the idea around that was to try and give people a little bit of confidence, a little bit of guidance coming out of lockdown, how to either rebuild their businesses or start from scratch if they'd lost what they had. And a lot of people at the top end of the business world have had far more challenges and far more bumps in the road than you might imagine. But the conversation relevant here was one with Imtiaz Patel, chair of DSTV and MultiChoice, and before that head of SuperSport. And he spoke about Mnet beginning, and how when Mnet began, the competition was SABC 1, SABC 2, and SABC 3. The competition today for DSTV, not just Mnet, and I say this as somebody who has a show on the DSTV platform, is the kid on the street corner with a phone filming her mate doing skateboard tricks, because you can now watch that on YouTube when you could be watching Mzansi Magic or CakeNet or the BBC or whatever else is on your bouquet. And that's without talking about a Netflix or heading over to Amazon Prime or any of these other spaces, of which there is a growing multitude. And so I received news midway through this season, a little bit of surprise, a great deal of delight, and absolutely no intention of checking that the numbers were correct, that we'd gone up by 30% in terms of our viewership, which is rewarding generally, but in this environment, incredibly so. And that says that we're getting something right. And it's not a show where we need to change, I don't think, too much of the format. You'd never want to become staid, but the show changes every week because it's got different people on it and they're telling different stories. And we've been telling stories around campfires for thousands of years, and it's part of human nature. And whether that story is making us laugh or making us cry or making us think, or it's a story that sits at the heart of so much of what we do and who we are. And marketing today is pretty much all about storytelling. And so it's making sure that you use the myriad channels that you need to promote your show and get people catching glimpses of it on other digital media channels, and leveraging the different guests you have to spread the gospel of what you're doing. But I look at somebody like Michael Parkinson, who he did his show for almost 50 years. There was nothing flash about Parky. He was just an enormously gifted host. And he did something I try to do a lot of. I'm nowhere near Michael Parkinson's class in any space, but certainly not this. And it's something I try and work on constantly. And that's the art of listening and letting people tell their stories. And quite often somebody will say something and you've got that quip, you've got that one-liner, and it'll get a laugh. But often you just need to pull it back and leave it and just let the person continue telling their story. And I'd love to think we're going to be able to keep doing that for a good few years to come, because I really enjoy it. And I've always said that I will say goodbye to the Dan Nicholl Show when I don't want to rock up at studio and run through everything. And there are a lot of challenges to it, late guest cancellations and trying to get people onto flights. And I'm the executive producer as well as the host. So ultimately it all comes down to me. But I've got an amazing team. They're absolutely fantastic. They do most of the show themselves, actually, in fairness. And so we're in a space that I feel has got the potential to continue. And we'll change a few things, we'll tweak them about, but the essence of the show is meeting cool people and telling cool stories, and that's what I want to keep doing.
I mean, long may it last. And tell me now, if there's one of the things I really want to learn from you is how you've managed to nail turning your interests and your passions into, viable business ventures. The Dan Nicholl Show, and then Dan really likes wine. How have you managed to do it for a second time?
So Dan really likes wine is a lot more accidental, but very, very happily so. The annotated version, I mentioned working at iAfrica.com. 3-4 months in, our lifestyle editor, whose remit encompassed everything from wine launches to restaurant openings to gallery events, was muttering about how she just didn't have time to do all of this. At the time, I'm in my early 20s, not much money, single, free food, free wine. This sounds like a space I could possibly work with. And so as casually as I could, I suggested to Lee, our editor, I might be able to find some time in my diary to go to one of these two. Dan, that would be brilliant. She said, have you done much food and wine writing? Oh, it's a passion, I said, flying through my teeth. And I got sent off a week later to go and attend a wine event an estate called Stellenzucht, which is now owned by the same guys who bought Ernie Els recently. Guy Weber, their winemaker, an iconic winemaking figure in the Cape Winelands, was hosting a Stellenzucht vertical tasting. Now, as an indication of how little I knew about wine, I got quite excited because I didn't think there were that many tall buildings in Stellenbosch. And clearly a vertical tasting meant you stood on top of a high building, looked down over the vineyards and drank wine. For those of you who are not wine drinkers, a vertical tasting takes you through vintages in ascending years. So you'll drink a 15 and then a 16 and then a 17 and compare them. I got taken down into a cellar, but this is a vertical tasting. This is not right. And for 3 hours did not understand a word as people who actually knew the world of wine talked about it and put me in my place very quickly. But it showed me immediately, this is something I want to know more about. And because I was on Cape Talk, I had some minor celebrity. And so whenever I got invited to these things, I'd often get seated next to the winemaker, completely unjustly, because I knew nothing about wine. But I would sit there and I would listen and I would listen and I would listen. And that began the educational process that then fed into the Cape Epic, an event I've hosted 15 or 16 times now. And in the afternoons, I'd drop in at wine farms and I'd go pick up wine. And that led into Dan's epic wine tasting, where I'd tell the story of the race through the medium of wine. This was day 2, where we drank this Chenin Blanc and give everybody an understanding of it. And at one of those, a guy called Michael Jordan, who was the CEO of F&B for many years, and he's actually got a sickness when it comes to entrepreneurship. He cannot stop himself. He came up to me and said he wanted to show me a video. I thought, well, you're Michael Jordan, you can do what you want, really. And he showed me a video of an American guy called Gary Vaynerchuk making early wine videos, which was how he started his media business. And Michael said to me, you're funnier than him, you know more about wine than him, you need to start a similar show. And I thought, well, based on what you've just said, you're clearly 7 bottles of Chardonnay down. So I smiled politely and nodded and let him go on his way. And Michael phoned me the next day. I don't know how, because I didn't give him my number. And the day after, and the day after that, have you started your wine show? And so in 2016, in my cellar, I'd knocked up a signboard with my design team for the Dan Nichols Show. We filmed the first episode of Dan Really Likes Wine. And there was no greater ambition than this could be a bit of fun. That really was it. And I didn't think it would last for too long, but I'll give it a try, see what happens. And that was November 2016. We now sit with 2 live shows a week, a magazine show. It's sponsored by Pick and Pay. There's a wine business in terms of consulting, hosting wine events, bringing wine into different spaces, and generally just having a huge amount of fun with something that's got, for me, a very close link to sport. Sport and wine both fly a South African flag around the world very highly and very consistently. You can see a great South African golfer somewhere in the world every week, another rugby player lighting up a European division. Similarly, you'll find a great bottle of Ken Forrester FMC at a top restaurant in London. You'll get some terrific Stellenbosch cab standing up to a Napa equivalent in California. And it's a space where I've become a lot more learned than I was. I've still got a huge way to go, and you never stop learning in anything, but wine especially. But also I just had a great deal of fun with it and met amazing people. And it's turned into, as I say, accidentally, a really cool part of the business.
It's so unbelievable. I mean, having come through corporate, I remember just having long chats with friends around, we're not going to fulfill our passion here, but we're getting paid a paycheck that's enough for us to go on good holidays, and maybe that's all that really matters. You really disprove that, right? I remember always thinking, yes, if someone could pay me to talk about current affairs or general knowledge, I'd be very happy. And then I dismissed it. I'm like, those things don't happen. You are I guess, the business case for how it can. What's your advice to people who want to turn their passions into something that is successful, a viable option in which they can actually live their life?
First of all, it's not going to be for everybody. It takes both a certain kind of personality and also a great deal of commitment. And you do have to put in a lot of hard work to make these sort of things happen. The prism of social media shows the world our best lives,
yep.
And not all the grimmer stuff that often goes into it. But we also live in a world where the opportunity is so much more flexible. If we go back to the times of our parents and our grandparents, the plan was you finished school and you either got a trade or you went to university, and then you got your first job, and 50 years later they gave you a gold watch, and that was it. You went on holiday twice a year, and you had a white picket fence, and everything was a lot more compartmentalized in terms of how lives should be led in an ideal way. And breaking free from those expectations, I think, was often quite difficult. Now we're in a space where you can be accountant by day, and you can have your racehorse or your postage stamp collecting podcast in the evening, or you can create stuff that allows you to dip into those passions, not just more than you might have been before in terms of your own interest, but in terms of sharing that interest, where you might have been the only stamp collector in the village, but thanks to the internet, you can now connect to all the other stamp collectors in the world. And that not only gives you that sense of community that is so important to building up something that can work, but also adds a bit of commercial viability. If before there was only one of me, but now there's 1,000, if those 1,000 people sit in a certain demographic or a certain space, maybe there's a brand that wants to interact with them, maybe there are people who want to talk to them. And so we can experiment and we can build stuff up. But you've got to, if you really want to do it beyond just this is a fun hobby, you've got to have a pretty good understanding of what the potential is and what's needed to deliver on that potential, and realizing that, okay, I'm going to do this. I'm going to do a daily Instagram live show. And then after 2 weeks, you realize that doing this every single day is actually taking a whole lot out. I've run out of guests and things to say. And you've built up a whole head of steam, and now it's gone. It's setting yourself some reasonable goals and limits, something my wife frequently tells me I'm not capable of doing. But saying, right, we're going to do this once a month and not once a week to find feet. We're going to have a bit of practice. We're going to not talk it up too much while we work out what we're trying to do. And then listening and talking and finding out from other people who've done something similar, and not necessarily on your topic, but in the way in which they've done it. I want to start an online video show. Who else has done that? I want to create a talk space. Who else is doing that? When we were doing the Dan Nichols show, I've watched Graham Norton for as long as I can remember. And Graham is masterful at what he does. So I watch that time and again, not just because it's entertaining, but to watch his craft. And that's where I learn. Similarly, I spend hours with winemakers and wine people who know loads more than I do about wine. I don't need to know what they know about wine. I need to know how to ask them about what they know about wine. And so my understanding doesn't have to be all encompassing, but it has to provide the platform to the end be able to go. And so work out what's the skill set I need to take my passion and turn it into something that could maybe be a business. And I think the other thing to do, it's something we really don't do enough of. And I was thinking about this in the build up to chatting to you. We're so often, and I do this on the Dan Nichols show. You've just finished your amazing film. What's next? What's coming up next? How are we going to be bigger and better and cooler and more amazing? And yes, you do want to keep growing. And yes, a lot of people are driven. I've got loads of things I still want to do. But I don't know that we always give ourselves enough credit for what we have done, or take a little bit of time. So, I don't have to be up till midnight tonight, sending out another 6 proposals or fine tuning my Instagram page. Let me actually go and watch last week's episode of the show, or watch something else entirely, and just think back, what, I've done quite well with this, and that's worthy of a pat on the back, and congratulate ourselves, and not resting on laurels, but not dismissing those laurels either. You've got them for a reason, and I think that often just gives us that little bit of a reminder of our self-worth, because in a current era where everything's so fleeting, it's a 15-second story, and it's what are we doing next? We lose the moment sometimes, and I risk sounding a little Eckhart Tolle-like, but I think we do need to appreciate ourselves a little more than we do, and be a bit kinder both to other people and to ourselves, and there's a lot of reward to be had from that.
I think that's amazing advice. I'm glad it's recorded so I can listen to this a few times over. Dan, last 2 questions.
Sure.
And as you mentioned earlier, it's one of those where the guest has perfectly led into what I was going to ask. Talking about reflecting back and looking at what you have done, what do you say you're most proud of in terms of what you've built over the years?
So I could get all cooey and sentimental and talk to you about my wife and my 2 incredible children, but my wife will shout at me for doing that. And the kids don't think I'm funny at all and refuse to watch my show if Bluey is on instead. So we'll leave them. Speaking indirectly of them, though, it's probably a sense of balance in that I'm able to do so many things that I love. Like most people in an entrepreneurial space, I probably do a little bit too much, and I maybe don't sleep quite enough, and the 6-pack is still a work in progress. But I get to live a life that I genuinely enjoy, and there are lots of spaces where I get to make a difference or being part of making a difference. And often when you're in a more public light, you sometimes don't know when you're making a difference, but sometimes you are putting a smile on a face somewhere or giving somebody a reason to think. But if I look more specifically, obviously getting the Dan Nicholl show up and off the ground and into 16 seasons is way beyond what I would have imagined. And I'm very proud of that on behalf of our team and not just myself, because it has been very much a team effort. But then also some of the things I remember hosting the Dunhill for the first time, and my front row was Samuel L. Jackson, Bill Murray, Michael Douglas. I think Dan Quayle was sitting right beside them for some reason. And finishing off, and Bill and Michael were the first 2 people to come up and shake my hand and say that was great. And my response, and I can remember it well, it was quite elegant. It was I've since got to know Bill quite well. We played golf together at the old course at St Andrews a couple of years ago, and we've done a lot of Laureus and Dunhill events together. But that was a kind of a moment that reflected on so many others that we've had. I think getting to see a lot of the world through doing something that I love, standing up on a stage at a conference at Yankee Stadium in front of 800 people, with one of Sports Great arenas lying behind me, or getting out and to an audience of a couple of thousand, raising a whole lot of money at a gala charity dinner in Hong Kong, spaces where you're very much out of your comfort zone in terms of where's home, but feeling right at home by being on stage and just enjoying yourself, and being able to enjoy yourself, because I think we need to, and especially in the world in which we live, where power is intermittent and roads look like Swiss cheese and politicians are a lamentable lot. Where we can take a little joy and a little positive reflection, it's important to do so. And last question. It's a bit of a time travel one. So I know some people get really upset with me because if they're serious about time travel. If you could somehow stand in front of 6-year-old Dan, what would you tell him to look forward to the most in the journey that's to come? I would tell him that he's probably not going to marry Dolly Parton, which apparently I told my mother I was going to do. And in fairness to Dolly, I'm pretty glad that didn't work out. I'm not sure it would have been the ideal match.
Oh.
You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to say I wouldn't at all, because and this is not me just trying to be find a clever way out of your question, but it is oh so easy to second guess ourselves and to have those sliding door moments and wonder what would have happened if you'd followed Gwyneth Paltrow onto the train. And I can think back. I remember I had an opportunity while I was still in Cape Town to come up to Johannesburg and to join one of the big commercial radio stations. And for one reason or another, I didn't. And I remember another TV opportunity that I gave up for something else. And I could look back and wonder, well, you know, what if I'd done that? What if I had gone down that road? But again, without being overly spiritual or karmic, that road then wouldn't have led me to where I am today. And it is certainly not a perfect life. And there are things I'd happily change or tweak or do a little differently. But by and large, I've got to where I am because of the decisions that I've made and the path that I've taken. So other than smiling more, and definitely at high school, trying not to, I played a lot of cricket, trying not to hook quite so early in my innings. I got caught at deep backward square leg a lot. Other than that, I think I'd be all right.
Oh, that's hilarious. Yeah, you've got to play off the front foot a bit more. Eh?
Correct.
Dan, thank you so much for your time, and what a great story. I think will really, really resonate with the listeners and just show how, you know, I think if you put in a lot of hard work and you have the right mentality, you can turn a passion into a long-term sustained success. So thank you so much.
It's been a great pleasure, Kieran, and thanks for bringing up some good memories. I've really enjoyed this.